The crystal chandelier hanging above the grand ballroom of the Elysium Hotel shimmered like a constellation of captured stars, casting a cold, indifferent light upon the hierarchy of the underworld gathered below. It was a cathedral of greed, filled with men in sharp Italian suits and women draped in silk that cost more than a common family earned in a decade. In the center of this opulent display stood Director Kong, a handsome man of 40 whose vanity was rivaled only by his cruelty. He held a flute of vintage champagne as if it were a scepter, his sharp Korean features twisted into a sneer of absolute authority. To him, the world was composed of two types of people, those he owned and those he had not yet broken. He was curtly focused on the former, his gaze bore down on the young woman kneeling at his feet, scrubbing a phantom stain from the polished marble floor. She was Amina, a stunning 24-year-old African woman whose beauty could not be dimmed even by the coarse, dark blue fabric of a maid's uniform. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes were lowered, but there was a stillness in her posture that suggested patience rather than submission. Kong deliberately tilted his glass, watching with sadistic glee as the golden liquid cascaded down, splashing onto Amina's hands and soaking into the knees of her uniform. The chatter in the ballroom died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, the kind of quiet that precedes an execution. Kong did not apologize. He merely checked his watch, bored by the very existence of the help. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice smooth and venomous, projecting clearly to the hundreds of watching guests. "This floor costs more than your life. Treat it with respect." The crowd, a collection of syndicate lieutenants and corrupt officials, watched with bated breath. They were predators, but even predators pause when a greater beast is feeding. Amina paused in her scrubbing. She did not tremble. She did not weep. Slowly, methodically, she placed the scrub brush into her bucket. The water turned murky, swirling with the dirt of the powerful. She stood up, her movements fluid and graceful, rising until she looked Kong in the eye. The height difference was negligible, but the difference in presence was colossal. "Apologize," Amina said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a resonance that cut through the tension like a diamond through glass. It was a command, not a request. A ripple of shock went through the room. A maid did not speak to a director of the Geum River Syndicate. A maid did not look a wolf in the eye without fear. Kong blinked, genuinely taken aback by the audacity, before a dark amusement curled his lip. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. "I think the fumes of the cleaning chemicals have rotted your brain, girl." Kong laughed, a dry, barking sound that invited the room to join him. A few nervous chuckles echoed, but most remained silent, sensing something dangerous in the air. "Do you know who I am? I could snap my fingers and you would cease to exist." Amina didn't blink. She held his gaze with a terrifying intensity, her dark eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for too long. "I know exactly who you are, Director Kong," she replied, her voice steady. "But you clearly have no idea who I am. I am not your maid. I am your boss." The sheer absurdity of the statement hung in the air for 3 agonizing seconds before Kong threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a theatrical, booming laugh, designed to humiliate, to strip her of any dignity she thought she possessed. He laughed until tears pricked his eyes, wiping them away with a silk handkerchief. "Did you hear that?" he shouted to the room, spreading his arms wide. "The help thinks she runs the syndicate. Perhaps I should give her a crown made of toilet brushes." The sycophants in the front row forced themselves to laugh, the sound grating and hollow. But Amina did not move. She stood like a statue of judgment in the center of the ballroom, waiting for the laughter to die. And as Kong turned back to her, breathless from his own amusement, he failed to notice that the service doors at the back of the room had quietly, simultaneously unlatched. 3 hours earlier, the atmosphere had been radically different in the penthouse suite 40 floors above. The air had been scented with jasmine and tension. Amina stood before a floor-to-length mirror, but the reflection showed a woman draped in gold and emerald silk, a queen in waiting. Behind her stood Ren, a man of few words and lethal capability, his broad shoulders tense beneath his tuxedo. He watched her with a mixture of devotion and frustration, his jaw set hard. He was the only one in the organization who knew the truth, the only one who had seen the will, the only one who knew that the ghost the syndicate feared was the woman standing before him. He hated this plan. He hated seeing her lower herself to the wolves just to prove they were rabid. "You don't have to do this, Amina," Ren said, his voice low and rough with suppressed emotion. He walked over, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if wanting to pull her back from the edge of a cliff. "We can take Kong down tonight. I have the files. I have the loyalty of the old guard. You don't need to put on that uniform. You don't need to let them look at you like you're nothing." Amina turned, her expression softening only for him. She reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of his jacket, a rare moment of tenderness in a life defined by warfare. "It is not about what I need, Ren," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "It is about what they need to see. My father built this organization on honor. Kong and his vipers have turned it into a slaughterhouse. If I simply take the throne, they will see a woman they can manipulate. They need to see their own arrogance reflected back at them. They need to see that power does not live in a suit." Ren looked away, pained. He had served her family for 15 years, rising from a street orphan to the right hand of the throne, and somewhere in the bloodshed, he had fallen hopelessly in love with the woman who now prepared to debase herself. "If he touches you," Ren said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "if he so much as lays a finger on you, the script is over. I will burn the building down with him inside." Amina smiled, a sad, knowing smile. She began to unbutton the silk dress, the gold fabric pooling on the floor, revealing the simple undergarments beneath. She reached for the dark blue uniform folded neatly on the bed, the armor of the invisible. "He will try," she said, pulling the rough fabric over her head. "That is his nature. But you must wait for the signal. Promise me, Ren." "Wait for the signal." Ren clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking. "I promise," he lied, knowing that if Kong crossed the line, no promise on earth would stop him. Back in the ballroom, the laughter was beginning to sour. Kang's amusement had faded into irritation. The joke was over, but the woman was still standing there, looking at him with that unnerving, regal calm. It made him feel small, and Director Kong detested feeling small. He signaled to the security detail, two hulking men who had been chuckling along with him. "Get her out of here." Kong snapped, his voice losing its polished veneer. "Throw her in the alley, with the rest of the garbage. And make sure she learns her lesson before you leave her there." The guards stepped forward, their shadows falling over Amina. The crowd watched, some looking away in shame, others watching with the morbid curiosity of roadside spectators. This was the moment of moral contrast, the point where the soul of the organization was weighed and found wanting. Amina did not retreat. She did not look at the guards. Her eyes remained locked on Kong. "This is your last chance, Director," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, harder. "Walk away. Resign. Leave the city tonight, and you keep your life." Kang's face turned a mottled shade of red. To be threatened was one thing. To be offered mercy by a servant was an insult he could not process. He grabbed a bottle of wine from a passing waiter's tray and smashed it against the table, the glass shattering, the red liquid exploding like a gunshot wound. "You threaten me?" he screamed, pointing the jagged bottleneck at her face. "I am the king of this city. I am the law. No one speaks to me like that." The violence in his motion made several guests gasp. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. The band had stopped playing entirely. The room was a vacuum of fear, centered on the jagged glass in Kang's hand and the unprotected face of the maid. In the periphery of the room, unseen by Kang's rage-blinded eyes, the dynamic was shifting. The waiters, who had been standing invisible against the walls, suddenly straightened. The busboys stopped clearing tables. At the main entrance, the doorman locked the heavy oak doors from the inside with a definitive clack. Ren, standing in the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, placed his hand on the railing, his knuckles white. He tapped his earpiece once. A simple, silent command. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with static electricity, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Kong stepped closer, the broken glass inches from Amina's cheek. "Kneel," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "Kneel and beg, and maybe I'll only scar you a little." Amina looked at the glass, then back to Kong. She sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. I told you, she said softly. I am the boss. She raised her right hand, snapping her fingers once. The sound was sharp, piercing the silence. Instantaneously, the service doors at the back of the hall burst open with a crash that shook the floorboards. But it wasn't kitchen staff that poured out. It was an army. Dozens of men in black tactical gear flooded into the room, moving with the precision of a flowing river. Simultaneously, the waiters and busboys in the room reached under their serving jackets and produced sidearms, leveling them not at the guests, but directly at Kang's security detail. The two guards reaching for Amina froze, feeling the cold steel of suppressors pressed against the base of their skulls. The transformation of the room was absolute. The chaotic luxury of the gala was instantly gridded by a disciplined military force. Kang spun around, his eyes wide, the broken bottle trembling in his hand. He looked for his allies, but the other lieutenants were backing away, hands raised, terrified by the sudden overwhelming display of force. The tactical team didn't shout. They didn't scream orders. They simply formed a perimeter, a wall of black suits and serious faces, creating a corridor that led directly to Amina. The silence now was different. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of judgment. Ren descended the grand staircase, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He walked past the trembling high rollers, past the frozen security, and came to a stop beside Amina. He didn't look at Kang. He looked at her. With a fluid motion, Ren took a white silk cloth from his pocket and offered it to her. Amina took it, wiping the champagne from her cheek. Then, she looked at the tactical team leader, a scarred veteran named Osik. Osik stepped forward, his eyes ignoring Kang completely. He faced the woman in the maid's uniform, snapped his heels together with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, and bowed, a deep, 90-degree bow of absolute reverence. Chairman, Osik barked, his voice filled with terrifying respect. As if triggered by a switch, every single soldier, every undercover agent, every armed waiter in the room turned to Amina and bowed in unison. The sound of hundreds of bodies moving as one, the rustle of fabric, and the collective chairman, shouted by 200 voices, shook the crystal of the chandelier. Kang stood alone, the only man upright in a sea of bowed heads. The broken bottle slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound pathetic and small compared to the roar of loyalty that had just occurred. He looked at Amina, really looked at her for the first time, and saw beyond the uniform. He saw the bone structure of the late godfather. He saw the eyes that had watched from the shadows for years. His knees began to shake. The color drained from his face until he was the shade of old ash. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. That's impossible. You're just I am the one who signs your checks, Kang, Amina said, stepping forward. The wall of soldiers parted for her. She didn't need to shout anymore. Her whisper was the loudest thing in the world. She walked up to him, the heels of her sensible work shoes clicking rhythmically on the marble. She stopped inches from him, looking down at the mess he had made on the floor. And you are fired, she gestured to Ren. Show him what we do with trash in this house. Ren stepped forward, a predatory smile finally gracing his lips. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. The maid was the queen, and the king was nothing more than a stain waiting to be scrubbed away. The silence that followed Ren's command was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating vacuum of a predator's cage finally snapping shut. Kang scrambled backward, his shoes slipping on the champagne he had so arrogantly poured only moments before, his hands grasping at the air as if he could physically pull his authority back into existence. But authority is a fragile illusion, constructed entirely of belief, and the room's belief had shifted tectonically to the woman standing still in the center of the floor. Amina did not move to strike him. She did not need to. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, as the reality of his position crashed down upon him like a collapsing building. Ren moved with the inexorable slowness of a glacier, stepping over the broken glass, his shadow falling long and heavy over Kang's trembling form. He didn't draw a weapon. To use a weapon on a man so thoroughly defeated would be an act of mercy, and Ren was not feeling merciful. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and withdrew a slim, black tablet, the screen glowing with a harsh, unforgiving light. He tapped it once, and the massive projection screen behind the stage, usually reserved for charity auction totals, flickered to life. It didn't show a montage of Kang's crimes. That would be too pedestrian. Instead, it showed a single, live banking interface. The numbers were plummeting.
What?
What are you doing? Kong gasped, his eyes darting from Ren to the screen, watching his net worth dissolve in real time. The digits rolled backward, millions vanishing into the digital ether every second. It was a digital execution, far more painful for a man like Kong than any physical wound. Stop it. That's my money. That's my money, he screamed, scrambling to his feet and lunging toward Ren, fueled by the desperate, blinding panic of greed. Before he could take 2 steps, Osik, the tactical leader, intercepted him. It was a brutal, efficient motion, a sweep of the leg and a shove to the chest that sent Kong crashing back to the floor, winded and gasping. The guests, who had previously laughed at Kang's jokes and eagerly consumed his expensive wine, now watched with cold, detached fascination. This was the nature of their world. When a king falls, the jackals don't mourn. They merely calculate the new odds. Amina stepped forward, her voice cutting through Kang's whimpering. That was never your money, Kong. It was the syndicate's blood. It was the profit of the suffering you caused against my father's orders. You built a kingdom on rot, and you are surprised that the floor has given way. She gestured to the screen, where the balance finally hit 0. You are not just fired. You are erased. Your assets have been liquidated and redistributed to the families you extorted. You have no home, no accounts, no allies. You are a ghost. Kong looked up, his face a mask of sheer horror. The realization was worse than death. In the underworld, a man without influence is a walking corpse. He looked around the room, his eyes pleading with the other lieutenants, men he had dined with, men he had plotted with. Help me, he shrieked, his voice cracking.
Joy. Park.
Do something. She's just a girl. She's a maid. But Director Choi and Director Park did not move. They stared straight ahead, their faces pale, refusing to make eye contact with the sinking ship. They knew that to align with Kong now was to sign their own death warrants. Ren leaned down, gripping Kong by the lapels of his ruined suit, lifting him until their noses almost touched. She's the chairman, Ren whispered, the sound like grinding stones. And you are trespassing, he nodded to the guards. Remove him. The back exit. He leaves with nothing but the clothes on his back, as the guards dragged Kong away, his heels skidding uselessly on the marble. His screams of protest faded into the bowels of the hotel, growing fainter until the heavy service doors slammed shut, sealing his fate. The room was left in a stunned, vibrating silence, the air charged with the ozone smell of absolute power. The departure of the guests was a somber, hurried affair, stripped of the usual lingering gossip and drunken goodbyes. The party was over in every sense of the word. They filed out like chastised schoolchildren, clutching their furs and purses, eyes cast downward, terrified that drawing attention to themselves might invite the same judgment that had befallen Kong. Within 20 minutes, the grand ballroom was empty, save for the scattering of broken glass, the spilled wine, and the small army of loyalists who stood at attention along the perimeter. The adrenaline that had sustained Amina through the confrontation began to ebb, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She stood in the center of the vast, empty space. The maid, uniform now feeling heavy and suffocating, a costume that had served its purpose but now clung to her like a second skin she was desperate to shed. The adrenaline crash was physical. Her hands, which had been steady as stone while facing down a madman, now began to tremble slightly. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath, the persona of the Iron Chairman, slipping just enough to reveal the young woman beneath. Ren was at her side instantly, his radar for her distress tuned to a frequency no one else could hear. He didn't speak immediately. He knew she needed a moment to ground herself. He simply stepped closer, his presence a solid wall against the rest of the world. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the blue uniform, a symbolic gesture of shielding her from the role she had been forced to play. The warmth of the jacket, smelling of him, cedar and gunpowder, wrapped around her, anchoring her. It's over, he said softly, his voice losing the harsh edge he used for the soldiers. They're gone. You can breathe now. Amina pulled the jacket tighter, opening her eyes to look at him. The ferocity was gone from her gaze, replaced by a vulnerability she showed only to him. Is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Calm was just a symptom, Ren. The rot goes deeper. Half the people in this room were laughing with him until the guns came out. Fear bought their loyalty tonight, but fear has a shelf life. She walked slowly toward the grand staircase, her steps heavy. Ren matched her pace, walking a half step behind her right shoulder. The eternal guardian. Fear is a start, Ren countered gently. Respect comes later. You show them something they haven't seen in a decade. You showed them consequence. Your father. He was a great man, Amina, but he forgave too easily. You showed them that the sword of justice actually has an edge. They reached the landing of the staircase, overlooking the debris of the night. Amina paused, her hand resting on the velvet railing. She looked down at the spot where she had scrubbed the floor. The stain was still there, wet and ugly. I don't want to rule by fear, Run, she admitted, turning to him. I don't want to be a tyrant who needs an army in the shadows just to walk into a room. I want to build something that lasts without bloodshed. Run reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before covering hers on the railing. His skin was rough, calloused from years of violence committed in her name. Then we build it, he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the stairwell thin. We tear down the old foundation, and we pour a new one. I will break every stone for you, if I have to.
But you
are the architect. Don't doubt the design just because the ground is messy. The boardroom of the Geum River Syndicate was located in a brutalist concrete tower on the other side of the city, a fortress of gray stone and dark glass that seemed to frown down upon the bustling streets of Seoul. It had been 3 days since the incident at the Elysium, and the atmosphere in the building was brittle with tension. The long mahogany table, which seated 20, was currently occupied by only 12 men. The empty chairs were conspicuous. They belonged to Kang's closest allies, who had been quietly retired from the organization in the intervening 48 hours. Amina sat at the head of the table. The maid's uniform was gone, burned in a ritualistic fire the night of the gala. She now wore a suit of sharp, charcoal wool, tailored to perfection, her hair loose and flowing, framing a face that was set in stone. She did not look like a 24-year-old inheritor. She looked like a veteran of 1,000 wars. On the table in front of her sat a single object, a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. The remaining directors shifted uncomfortably. They were powerful men who controlled shipping lanes, construction contracts, and gambling dens, but under Amina's gaze, they looked like schoolboys waiting for the cane. Rin stood behind her chair, silent and imposing, his eyes scanning the room for the slightest twitch of disrespect. This book, Amina began, her voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room, contains the original bylaws of the syndicate, written by my grandfather. I spent the last 2 nights reading it. She placed a hand on the leather cover. Nowhere in here does it mention human trafficking. Nowhere does it mention extortion of the poor. Nowhere does it sanction the poisoning of our own community with cheap narcotics. She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. We have strayed so far from the path that we are no longer a family. We are a cancer. Director Choi, a man with gray hair and a nervous tick in his left eye, cleared his throat. Chairman, he started, his voice trembling. With all due respect, the markets have changed. If we cut those revenue streams, the losses would be catastrophic. We have overheads. Amina didn't raise her voice, but she cut him off with a glance that was colder than liquid nitrogen. Catastrophic for whom? Director Choi? For your mistress's apartment? For your gambling debts? She opened the ledger and pulled out a modern tablet that had been tucked inside. She slid it down the table. It spun smoothly, coming to a stop in front of Choi. I know about the skimming operations in the logistics department. I know about the side deals with the rivals in the south. Choi went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. You have a choice, Amina announced to the room. The organization reboots today. We return to legitimate enterprise, protection, and high-stakes arbitration. The filth ends. Anyone who cannot survive without feeding on the weak can leave now. She leaned forward. But if you stay, and I catch you crossing the line again, you won't get the mercy I showed Kong. Later that night, the city was awash in rain, a heavy downpour that hammered against the glass walls of Amina's private office. The lights of the skyline were blurred into streaks of neon and gold, a beautiful, chaotic mess. Amina stood by the window, watching the storm. The meeting had been a bloodless massacre. 3 more directors had resigned on the spot, terrified of the new regime. The syndicate was smaller now, leaner, but for the first time in years it felt clean. Yet the weight of it was crushing. She felt the ghost of her father in the room, a silent specter judging her dismantling of his empire. Had she gone too far? Had she weakened them to the point of collapse? The doubt was a cold knot in her stomach. She hugged her arms around herself, feeling small against the backdrop of the stormy city. The door opened softly, and Ren entered. He carried 2 mugs of tea, the steam rising in curling ribbons. He didn't ask if he could come in. The boundaries between them had eroded significantly since the ballroom. He walked over to the window and held out a mug. Amina took it, her fingers brushing his, lingering for a second longer than necessary. They are calling you the Iron Queen on the streets, Ren said quietly, looking out at the rain. The lower ranks are celebrating. They hated Kong. You have given them back their pride. Amina took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. I don't care about the titles, Ren. I care about the cost. We lost 30% of our revenue today. We have enemies in the south who will smell blood. Let them come, Ren said, turning to face her. His expression was fierce, possessive. Let them come and break their teeth on our walls. You didn't weaken us, Amina. You cut out the infection. A smaller army that believes in its general is worth 10 times a mercenary horde. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, forcing her to look at him. The gesture was intimate, shattering the last remnants of their professional distance. You are not your father. You are better. He built the walls, but you are building the home inside them. And he paused, his voice thick with emotion. I have served this family for half my life. I have never believed in it until now. Until you. Amina leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, the exhaustion finally melting away into something softer, something warmer. I can't do this alone, Ren, she whispered. Everyone looks at the chairman, but who does the chairman look at? Ren smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face. You look at me, he promised. Always. The morning sun broke over Seoul with a clarity that felt symbolic. The storm had washed the smog from the air, leaving the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. On the rooftop terrace of the syndicate's headquarters, a helicopter waited, its blades slowly beginning to spin. But the mood was not one of escape, it was one of arrival. Amina walked out onto the terrace, the wind whipping her hair back. She wasn't wearing a suit today, nor a uniform. She wore a simple white dress, bright and unburdened. Ren walked beside her, carrying a briefcase, but his posture was less rigid, less guarded. The war was far from over. In their world, the war is never truly over, but the internal battle was won. They had retaken the soul of the family. They stopped at the railing, looking down at the city that sprawled beneath them. It was a beast of a city, full of danger and opportunity, but it no longer looked like a monster to be tamed. It looked like a responsibility. Amina took a deep breath of the cool, high-altitude air. She thought of the girls scrubbing the floor, the humiliation, the laughter of the cruel men. It seemed like a lifetime ago. She had walked through the fire and dragged the truth out with her. She turned to Ren, who was checking his watch, ever the pragmatist. Ready to go? He asked. The meeting with the shipping guild is in an hour. Amina smiled, and this time, it was a smile of pure confidence, radiant and dangerous. Let them wait a moment, she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of blue fabric, a scrap she had cut from a uniform before burning it. She held it over the edge of the railing, letting the wind catch it. She opened her fingers, and the scrap of blue fluttered away, dancing on the updrafts, spiraling down toward the streets below until it disappeared into the vastness of the world. It was a final release, a letting go of the disguise. She turned back to Run, her eyes shining. Okay, she said, nodding toward the waiting helicopter. Now I'm ready. "Let's go to work," Ren offered his arm, and she took it, not as a boss taking a subordinate's arm, but as a partner taking her equals. Together, they walked toward the rising sun and the roar of the engines, ready to rewrite the rules of the world.